Great. Hi, everyone. I'm C. Rose now, and I'm really happy to introduce Dr. David G. Lanoue for his presentation, Poetry in English, How Renku Changed Everything. Dr. Lanoue is the Rosemary Endowed Professor of English at Xavier University of Louisiana. Since his first essay on Issa's frogs appeared in Modern Haiku in 1985, he has published several books and over 50 essays on Japanese haiku. He maintains the Haiku of Kobayashi Issa website, for which he has translated, wait for it, 11,670 haiku so far. I think his presentation today sounds fascinating. Early in the 20th century, Ezra Pound discovered hokku, the specially constructed starting verse of renga that was already in Japan, thanks to Shiki, morphing into the one-verse art of haiku. Pound's encounter with hokku revolutionized English language poetry. Before he met hokku, verse in England and in English-speaking countries was more linear, more chronological, more discursive, more abstract, more verbose, and more locked inside the prison of strict meter. After Pound's encounter with Japanese hokku, English language poetry became, on the whole, less linear, less time-bound, more evocative, more imagistic, more concise, and much freer in its meter. This presentation by Dr. Lanoue will show how the aesthetic assumptions and Buddhist philosophy embodied in renga made modern Anglo-American poetry possible. So please welcome Dr. Lanoue.
Okay, thank you guys. Hey, C, can I share my screen? And I have the keys to the kingdom?
Let me check. You should be able to. Yes, you can share.
I'll just see. Okay, share screen. Okay. Oh, you see my screen? Okay, I have some PowerPoints down here. And okay, all right. Hello, I want this. Okay, warm up. Okay. Yeah, poetry in English. I think Renku did change everything. And yeah, Pound is in the center of a cluster of people. We can't put it all on Pound, but the people around him, and that's what I'm going to try to describe today. So I'm going to argue today that there's really two phases of Anglo-American poetry, pre-Ezra Pound and post-Ezra Pound. And although it would be wrong to claim that Pound deserves all the credit for the shifting of English language poetry into modern mode, he was a seminal member of a group of early 20th century poets in England and America who revised the premises of what a poem is. Pound and his friends, including T.S. Eliot, John Gould Fletcher, William Carlos Williams, and perhaps not quite his friend, but his frenemy, Amy Lowell, they were instrumental in a modernist transformation of English language poetry that I hope to show today took place the way it did only because of an importation of Japanese aesthetic principles, specifically from the literary art of hokku, a fragmentary imagistic verse shaped by the rich 1,200-year tradition of Japanese renga. Now, renga is a form of group written linked poetry that embodies a set of artistic and philosophical assumptions that I hope to demonstrate became important to Pound and his circle. And thanks to them, well, to us, anyone who's writing poetry after the early 20th century. First, I'd like to call attention to an editorial policy quite familiar to me back in the 80s when I first was writing haiku and looking for mainstream poetry journals that might publish my work. In the Poets Market of those days, I often came across the please, no haiku policy. Even today, a quick check of the submission policy of contemporary poetry and literary journals shows that this anti-haiku prejudice persists. And you can see for yourself, Parsippany Review, Slant, Muscle and Blood, Timber Ghost Press, Fixator. The writer's market has a dire warning from many publishers that I remember seeing very often in the 80s and 90s, both in writer's market and the poet's market. And that was no haiku, religious, or rhyme. Even the organizers of the official poetry contest of the Chicago Bacon Fest of 2016 felt it necessary to stipulate in the guidelines no haiku. They said, quote, "This is the Bacon Fest poetry contest, not some middle school writing assignment you're trying to dodge." So I'm hoping by the end of this talk that the deeply ironic nature of this no haiku policy will, in poetry presses and in poetry journals, will become very evident, because as I want to show today, to a large extent, what is modern poetry, it exists because of the encounter, the Western encounter with hokku, which is more commonly known today as haiku. And I'll break that down a little bit more later too. Sir Charles Eliot, British diplomat in early 20th century, would have agreed with the Bacon Fest organizers. In Letters from the Far East, a book he published in 1907, several years before he became ambassador to Japan, Sir Charles made it quite clear that for him, hokku simply does not qualify as poetry, and his quote is, "The three-lined poems are not only impressionist, but so elliptical and enigmatical as to be unintelligible to a foreigner. Thus, when a Japanese writes, 'That single note did the moon sing cuckoo,' he is under the impression that he has produced a poem." It's really bad. I'll read a little more. Sir Charles goes on and says, quote, "It does not appear that any poet of genius or even of particular talent has ever arisen in Japan, limiting poems to 3 lines," this is his words, again I quote, "amounted to, quote, an enforced dwarfing of possible Homers that must have been, quote, disastrous to the national genius." Thank you, Sir Charles, for sharing. Now, to help understand where he's coming from, Sir Charles, in his assumptions about poetry, on the screen is an example of what English poetry was supposed to look like, typically look like in 1907, the year of his sweeping statement about lack of poetic genius and dwarfing of potential Homers. Joseph Campbell published The Gilly of Christ that year, which reads in part, "I am the Gilly of Christ, the mate of Mary's son. I run the roads at seeding time and when the harvest's done." And it goes on. Contemporary poetry editors who stipulate no religious or rhyme would doubtlessly reject Campbell's poem on sight. But in 1907, it was state-of-the-art little masterpiece. A gilly, by the way, is a Scottish Highland chief. Sir Charles Eliot expected to find in a poem exactly what Campbell delivers: chronological, linear structure, strict rhythm, strong rhyme, and metaphors, pointing away from the image towards an abstract idea. In this sense, the abstract concept is a commitment to religious faith. So maybe condemning Sir Charles' snobbish and frankly jingoistic rejection of Japanese hokku as poetry, it has to be kind of taken with the grain of salt that he was, after all, indoctrinated into this idea of what a poetry should look like pre-Ezra Pound. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What happens after Pound? Let's look at Pound's friend, right? His lifelong friend, William Carlos Williams. They went to college together. He publishes in 1938, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. A sea change has happened. But how and why? So, well, here's my thesis. Between Gilly of Christ and Red Wheelbarrow, Pound and his friends and frenemy, Amy Lowell, encountered Japanese hokku and the Japanese aesthetic principles that shaped it. Now, a lot of people say Yone Noguchi was Pound's source. Anita Patterson in 2009 gave a talk on this titled Ezra Pound, Yone Noguchi, and Modernist Japonisme. She believed that Pound's encounter with Noguchi, quote, fostered ideas about poetic form that would in turn prove essential to the flowering of modernism in the Americas. Patterson notes, in addition to his meeting with Yone Noguchi, Pound also might have learned about hokku through French translations of Japanese by symbolists like Paul-Louis Couchard, and through English translations of Japanese haiku by F.S. Flint and other members of the School of Image in London. However, as Yoshinobu Hakutani noted in a 1992 essay, the French translators always use the term haiku or haikai, whereas Pound, like Noguchi, consistently used only the term hokku. So that's a clue. So Hakutani is convinced Noguchi was the primary conduit of ideas about hokku for Pound, but however, Andrew Hohen, whose new book, Ezra Pound's Japan, appearing this year, it's like $100-something as an ebook now, but if you wait till September, it'll be out in paperback. He has a new book called Ezra Pound's Japan, where he disputes this thesis that Pound relied on Noguchi. In a way, I'm just giving you this background. To me and my argument, it doesn't matter where they got the idea. They got the idea. But we'll dive a little deeper into arcana here. Get ready for deep dive here. Okay, Hohen acknowledges that Pound owes Flint for some information about hokku, but Flint didn't talk about superposition, a concept that we're about to see became central to Pound's understanding of the form. So remember that, superposition. So for this concept, Hohen says Pound relied partly on Lawrence Binyon, who at the time he was a poet also, but he was working at the British Museum, assistant keeper of prints and drawings. He gave a series of lectures in 1909 on art and thought in East and West, and we know Pound attended at least 2 of them. So other things were churning up. Japan was coming into consciousness, and I'll argue in a 25-year period from 1888 to like 19 whatever, add 25 years to 88. Now, this guy Hohen in his new book, actually he said this before in an article, that this no play, Takasago, was where Pound got the idea of superposition. Now, how does Pound have, Pound didn't read Japanese, he didn't read Chinese, and yet he translates Japanese and Chinese. Some of you guys know this, but in case you don't, I'll tell you that story. Well, what happened is in 1913, Ernest Fenelos's widow gave Pound her husband's notes on Chinese and Japanese literature. And so Pound took those notes and, what we call polishing a translation without knowing the language, he polished up some translations of traditional Chinese poetry, and in 1915 published that as a book titled Cathay. But we now also know, based on a 1991 discovery of unpublished translations of Pound, that even before that, he was translating these no plays. Hohen claims, therefore, that the Pound's translation of what Pound considered to be this quintessential no play, Takasago, it's about 2 pine trees, by the way, who are like bound to each other by karma and time. He felt like this is where Pound got superposition, a sort of a sense of past and present in one superimposed image. In Takasago, past and present merge in the ai-oi pun, representation of the eternal relationship between these 2 pine trees, and which is like the external relationship is ai, and oi is the time-bound process and movement. So kind of like eternal in history. This is where Pound derived the superposition view, according to Howen. I wanted to read more from Howen's book. I haven't read the whole book yet, but I think as of now, I have some reservations about this passing Occam's razor. Occam said, if there's a simpler explanation, go with it. Well, I mean, Pound does have a very clear and simple source for superposition in haiku, and that was what he said about hokku. and the two examples that he uses himself. Anyway, so out of that rabbit hole, back to the main point here. We know from Pound's 1916 memoir that in the vorticism section, he was starting after imagism, he's starting a new movement he wanted to call vorticism. Anyway, that Victor Plar, one of his friends, once told Pound about he's walking along in the wintertime with the Japanese naval officer who sees a cat walk across the path in the snow. And you could read it. Yeah, this is just like took us straight from the book. The footsteps of the cat upon the snow are like plum blossoms. Pound adds, the words are like, and he puts them in parentheses, notice. The words are like would not occur in the original, but I add them for clarity, unquote. That's Pound writing. In other words, the actual poem would read, the footsteps of the cat upon the snow, plum blossoms. See, we're used to haiku, we get that. But there was a time when that would send someone like, Sir Charles bonkers, like, what? You're missing something. So Pound is kind of being reader friendly here. You have to learn how, not only to write haiku, you have to learn how to read haiku. And we're used to it. But why are we used to it? Because it was coming into English around this time and people had to learn it. Reflecting a hokku, Pound describes it as a one-image poem, interestingly enough. But he says, quote, it's a form of superposition. That is to say, it is one idea set on top of another, end quote. So in Pound's imagination, the two become one. The two images, right? They merge to join and become a single superimposed image of cat prints in snow and plum blossoms. Interestingly, plum blossoms often are presented in Japanese crests and kimono patterns as simplified symmetrical clusters of 5 circles. Cat footprints can also contain 5 design elements, visually quite similar. So, and also as early spring blossom, the earliest blossoms of spring are the plum blossoms. There's kind of an embodiment of the promise of new life in the plum blossom, but this new life of spring is printed in the snow. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, or to use Pound's word, superposition. This is how Pound conceived of it, superposition of paw prints in snow and plum blossoms. And has, as we can see, you can imagine, a deeper signification to the Japanese imagination that it's cold now, but spring will come, right? New life is on its way. So I don't think Pound needed to derive superposition from an obscure pun in the no play, Takasago. I'm keeping an open mind, but I think this superposition of image to image is just right here in the hokku example that Pound himself cites. What is hokku? Okay. Pound quotes another life-affirming hokku in the same memoir in relation to his own attempt to write his very famous, some people call it the first haiku in English, his poem about something he had witnessed in the Paris Metro Concorde station. It's without attribution, but by Moritake. The fallen blossom flies back to its branch, a butterfly. Pound found this example of hokku and its superposition of images, quote unquote, useful, he said, in quote, getting out of the impasse in which I had been left by the metro emotion. I wrote a 30-line poem and destroyed it because it was what we would call a work of second intensity. 6 months later, I made a poem half the length, and a year later, I made the following hokku-like sentence: the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So after long and deep contemplation of what? Of Japanese hokku, the poem In a Station of the Metro came to be. English poetry was changing. This is not the Gilly of Christ. Now, to understand what Pound learned from hokku, it's necessary to look closely at this poetic form. And because hokku is the first verse of renga, we should look at renga. But then, wait a minute, Before that, we had waka. We have to reach back to the mother of them all, waka. In the 8th century, waka was the most popular form of poetry in the Japanese court at Nara. Among the Japanese elite, okay? Ordinary people hadn't picked it up yet, but this is for the elite. Non-rhyming, 5-phrase poem, also known as tanka, more popularly. A lot of you guys probably write tanka as well. It has 5-7-5, 7-7 sound units in Japanese, roughly equivalent to syllables. But if you know the Japanese syllabary, it's not exactly syllables, but close enough, 5-7-5, 7-7. So what happened? How does waka jump over and become renga? Otomo no Yakumochi. Now, who was this guy? He was a military commander, a poet. He was one of the editors of the Manyo Shu, the 10,000 Leaves, first great poetic anthology of the period. He collaborated with an unnamed Buddhist nun. Who is she? Probably a lady of the court. It's very common that to retire to temple life, maybe following the death of her husband. Well, they decided, let's write a waka together, call and response style. She wrote the top part. So this is important to remember. Renga has inside it hidden a series of interlocking waka. A lot of people don't notice that. So here's the first renga. She wrote the top part. And my footnote says, I've looked at this. It's actually in Japanese 5-8-5, but close enough. Anyway, she wrote, whoever dammed Saho's rivers, waters to plant rice fields, and Yakumochi answered in the 7-7, should be the one to harvest the rice. And there's a whole story behind this poem, but trust me, the fact that renga began here is more important than the content. So I don't want to go into that. So here's how it works. From this humble beginning, renga grows beyond a scope of a single waka to become a series of interlocking wakas. So you have the first poet A starts again with this. See the poet A 5-7-5 with the special verse called the hokku, which is different from others. We're going to talk about that later. Why is hokku different? And it's like what Michael Dylan Welch said earlier this morning in the chat. They're not different. It's just, do you expect somebody to come after or not, right? So hokku and haiku are very similar. They're identical. Okay, so now poet B capped it, added 7-7. Now we have first waka. Now poet C is theoretically not even looking at the first poem, but kind of riffing off of the next 7-7 to make sort of an upside down waka, 7-7, 5-7-5. So this is, and the idea is to link and shift, link to what was before, shift ahead into new imaginative territory, like that linking, shifting wine bottle, which actually I wrote that haiku at HNA in Winston-Salem. The art of renga, if you weren't here this morning, you don't know what I'm talking about. Sorry, see, this was mentioned this morning. It was in one of the presentations. Okay, the art of renga is akin to a landscape painting on folding screens, okay? So screens A and B continue a single scene with elements of both continuity and difference, right? And then B and C, same thing, continuity and difference, and you can go right or left, but that's how renga is constructed, and that's how it's read. And as you focus always on the present scene, previous scenes begin to fade from consciousness, right? Which is a very important aspect of renga that 600 years later, Buddhist priests are going to latch onto, the Buddhist monks. They're going to grab renga and reshape it into Buddhist ritual. And I cite Gary L. Ebersol. I think you can find this article online from the Eastern Buddhist Journal, Fine Journal. In the 14th century, Muromachi period, monks transform the courtly game of renga into a Buddhist ritual for realizing the transience of things. So remember those folding screens, right? So as poets move together through their renga, the focus is always on the present scene. The present combined shifting forward waka, right? That's embedded inside the renga. Earlier scenes, like the earlier panels of a long unfolding landscape, they should be fading from memory. And this is a good thing because it helps poets and readers of renga to realize Buddha's core teaching that nothing in the universe abides, transience, an experience of transience, the transience of life, the ineffable transience, the slipperiness of life. And in addition to experiencing this spiritual truth, writing with friends is a way of stepping outside the prison of the ego. And because instead of I did it, renga poets can only say, we did it, right? So the aim of every renga is spiritual now. To reach the penultimate verse is always blossoms. The second to last verse is always blossoms. And that symbolizes what? Buddhist enlightenment. And then there's a coda, final spring poem that always ends after the second to last poem. And that's also spring, new beginning. Going back, like first there was a mountain, then there's no mountain, then there's a mountain again. Now you're back in the world, but you have an enlightened perspective. Yeah, Shiki. Let's consider this very first verse of Renga, the hokku. Now, near the end of the 19th century, Masaoka Shiki broke the hokku free of Renga, declaring it to be a new and independent form he dubbed haiku. This means when Pound encountered hokku in the early 20th century, this verse in Japan already had two meanings, competing meanings. For traditionalists, it was still and always only the starting verse for Renga. For Shiki-influenced, more modern-leaning folks, it had become an independent poetic form known as the haiku. The traditionalists consider Shiki's invention of haiku as a travesty, akin to reducing the whole game of tennis to just an opening serve. On the other hand, the modernists on their side, they wanted to create a one-breath form of secular poetry, free of the musty old rituals of Buddhism. This was a very Meiji period, opening to the West time. I only mention this deep split in the Japanese understanding of hokku in passing, because it has not real important bearing, but just so you know, this is the background, it's complex. But what Pound learned from it, it doesn't matter because like I said before, hokku and haiku are the same thing. The only difference being whether one views it as the beginning of a longer collaborative work, perhaps a Buddhist ritual in discovering and realizing, transience of the world, breaking free of ego and arriving at enlightenment? Or is it a work of art? Something for Poetry Magazine, something to claim, put your name by it and say, I did that, I'm proud of it. So before Pound, and this was in my my summary that C's already read to you, like what was hokku? Before poetry, what was poetry before hokku? Well, it was more linear. Think Gilly of Christ, telling a story. For beginning, middle, end, more discursive, more abstract. The metaphors are pointing to an idea about I'm the Gilly of Christ. I serve Jesus, and I have an idea behind it all. More wordy, more verbose, and more locked in a prison of meter. And then, of course, after we have think Red Wheelbarrow. Think of that Red Wheelbarrow. It's not about linearity or chronology. Chronology, yeah. It's evocative, imagistic, concise, freer in its meter. And my whole argument is we can thank the Japanese hokku for this revolutionary change in Anglo-American poetry. Now, what else? We have to look deeper at hokku because it's a special verse. Now, what makes hokku, and for that matter, Shiki's renamed independent version of it, haiku, special? Unlike other renga verses, only the hokku has an internal break, such that it consists of two juxtaposed images that elicit in the minds of readers a pleasant leap from image to image, like a jump cut in film. This leap is presented, not explained. And so recall Pound's example, the footsteps of the cat upon the snow plum blossoms. There's no need for explanatory words like the footsteps of the cat upon the snow are like plum blossoms. No, we're beyond this. We're learning to read imagery in a more Japanese way. Basho, yeah, his famous hokku. The old pond. This is my translation. Old pond, a frog jumping into water sound. I came up with that translation because I want to honor that last word, oto, sound. And everything else is modifying. What kind of sound is it? It's mizu no oto, water sound. What kind of water sound? Is tobikomu no mizu no oto, jumping into water sound. And then it's really, the whole thing is a frog jumping into water sound. But see the break? It's that in English, the break is that I put a dash there after old pond. In Japanese, it's the ya, sort of a particle. So old pond, break, dash, cut, second image, frog jumping into the water. Put, you know, so you have on one side old pond, and on the, then you have a shift, and a frog jumps in with a plop. And this is why we call hokku a microcosm of renga. Okay. So what's in Renga's DNA? Well, yeah, it's a type of linked poetry written by a circle of friends. There's a multitude of voices. It's couched in Buddhist ritual. This is going to be important. I mean, a lot of people who write haiku today, or even renga today, or renku, renku and renga are interchangeable terms, really. They might not think of themselves as being doing something very Buddhist, but it comes from a Buddhist sensibility of not explaining things, of just noticing and contemplating. And that's part of imagery too, of imagism too. And it's more fragmentary when a lot of people are throwing in their words. As you know, if you've done a renga with anyone, it's so much fun to see how you can write something that no one person could write, because sometimes the leaps of imagination are just so wild. So the Buddhist ritual of renga honors the mysteries of life without attempting to understand or explain them. Instead of latching on to a meaning or theme, renga, this is important, it's about visualizing without explaining, visualizing without analyzing. This is also what Pound learned when he wrote his Metro poem. He learned it straight from hokku. So what's the hokku effect? The hokku effect enables a transformation of English poetry from I am the gilly of Christ, the maid of Mary's son, to so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. This is a movement away from explanation towards raw image, a movement away from full paragraphs to intense fragments. Oh yeah, this is fun. A lot of you guys might know T.S. Eliot's great modernist poem, The Wasteland, was edited by Pound. Pound just cut and cut and cut. I have a quote here from Mark Ford. And actually, yeah, he's mentioned there. His article was written for the British Library. Quote, "It was Pound's deletions that most improved The Wasteland." Get it? That whole idea of say more by saying less, that is also part of the hokku spirit. In addition to cutting hugely, Pound critiqued passages where the meter was too predictable, too tumpum, he called it, too tumpum, or too stuck in iambic pentameter, too penty. Et, like I say in the slide here, was a German term for that's the real thing. That was high praise. When Eliot did something that Pound really approved of, he wrote ect, like for, in this example, a rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank. Not discursive, image speaking for itself, loud and clear. Above all, Pound's slashing of Eliot's manuscript, this is interesting, paradoxically made a very long poem feel minimalistic. To write this essay, I went back and reread it for the first time in years, and it's long, but it feels so fragmentary, minimalistic. It feels short. In much the same way that Japanese hokku is minimalistic. And recall that, like I mentioned, hokku is a microcosm of renga. What does that mean? It has the internal break, a leap from image A to image B. So as Robert Bly observed, oh, I love this book, guys. 1975 book. I got it when it was hot off the press, Leaping Poetry, an idea with poems and translations. Just a beautiful book about, he's talking about surrealism a lot, Bly is. but he also mentions haiku in it. Bly writes, to create the most power, the brightest intellectual spark, the imaginary movement from image to image must not be explained. This perfectly describes the inner working of hokku. And of course, the sparks that go between verse and verse in a renga. But just right there, it's a beautiful, so get it? So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. So much. Okay, back to Sir Charles. I'll sum up some of the things he could not fathom in 1907. That linear chronological verse encased in rigid meter was on its way out, a relic of an earlier, more optimistic time. So think Alexander Pope's 18th century heroic couplets, the Enlightenment, age of optimism. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. That kind of Gilly of Christ poetry played itself out by the early 20th century. It would no longer fly. For serious readers, why? Maybe many people said the senseless horrors of World War I. One might call them the lost generation, like Gertrude Stein did, or why not call them the things have fallen apart generation, to use a line from Yeats in The Second Coming. In any case, Sir Charles could not have predicted that nonlinear, non-rhyming, non-sing-song, image-to-image, leaping aesthetic of Japanese hokku, of which he had no understanding and zero respect, would come to fulfill a deep cultural need for poets and readers of a shattered world order. Anglo-American poetry became what it did become to a large extent, thanks to the cross-cultural encounter of Western poets like Pound with the aesthetic of haiku. John Gould Fletcher. Now, he was one of the members of Pound's Circle, a familiar name for some of you guys who are students of haiku in English, because he dabbled in the form. He published his own hokku experiments. This is from a 1918 book, Japanese Prince, and this is actually a picture from a page of that book, A Poet's Moods, Fluttering Butterflies in the Rain. Much later, Fletcher wrote the introduction to Kenneth Yasuda's A Pepper Pod. Some of you guys might know about that, 1947. So he was around a long time. He attended this famous dinner party with Amy Lowell that she hosted in London in July of 1914. And well, that's supposedly where Pound and Lowell had a rift, because Pound made some joke at her expense that involved the prop of a tin bathtub. But a long story, not worth telling here. Just to say, he was there from the beginning. And if you look at his bio, they're going to say he learned about haiku in the winter of 1914-15, because he went to the Art Institute of Chicago. But let's keep in mind, John Gould Fletcher, a very good friend of Ezra Pound, knew the Metro poem, and that was published a year before 1914 in 1913. So while the visit to the Art Institute surely must have been inspiring to Fletcher, the seed of interest in hokku, with this attendant possibility of writing hokku-like poetry, superpositions, had already been planted by Pound. Okay, now let's get to Amy. Now, while Pound played an undeniably central role in the importation of aesthetic values of hokku in modernist poetry, we must remember he was not the only prominent poet to turn to the Far East, particularly Japan, for inspiration. Long before she met Pound, Amy Lowell was interested in Japanese art and culture. When she was very young, still a young girl living at home, her brother, here he is in the picture, Percival, traveled to Japan as the assistant to the American envoy. And the fun fact, this is the same Percival Lowell who later in life becomes an astronomer and sort of floats the idea that there are canals on Mars. Anyway, fun fact. Now, he wrote a book based on his experiences in Japan and Korea that he titled The Soul of the Far East, 1888. That's why I say we have to talk about this influence going 1888 to 1913-ish, right? That's what we're talking about. Lafcadio Hearn, Now I live in New Orleans. Everyone knows Lafcadio Hearn in New Orleans, but maybe you guys, some of you do, some don't. He was living in Martinique at the time in 1888 after a long sojourn here, working on the Times-Picayune, our newspaper down here. He read this book and he lavished praise on it. He described it as, quote, an outstanding book, a godlike book. In fact, Percival Lowell's book inspired Hearn to move to Japan, where he becomes one of the first naturalized citizens of Japan and starts to write his own works about that country's customs and cultures. And Michael Katz, who wrote about Amy Lowell and Asia, wrote, most likely Amy was familiar with Lafcadio Hearn at a very early age. So, and he points out that Lowell's poetry, such as, quote, a London thoroughfare, 2 a.m., it's sparse, it's evocative, it's concrete. It could be, quote, a Japanese print by Hokusai. So it's interesting. Amy's brother, Percival, had observed in his book, quote, a Japanese painting is a poem rather than a picture. It portrays an emotion called upon by a scene and not the scene itself in all its elaborate complexity. According to Katz, minimalism and evocative power of Japanese art, which shares with hokku a common source in Japanese Buddhist aesthetic tradition, directly shape Amy Lowell's poetry. Okay, just a few more slides. Okay, well, this Lafcadio Hearn, I just got to put him out here. This is one of the most beautiful quotes I've ever read about haiku. And Amy probably had read this passage. So certainly he's a factor. The term itakiri, meaning all gone or entirely vanished in the sense of all told, is contemptuously applied to verses in which the verse maker has uttered his whole thought, praise being reserved for compositions that leave in the mind the thrilling of a something unsaid, like the single stroke of a temple bell. The perfect short poem should set murmuring and undulating in the mind of the reader many a ghostly aftertone of long duration. Wow, wouldn't you like people to say that about your haiku? I hope they will. I'm not going to read all this to you or at you. I'm just going to highlight 1915, Amy Lowell edits an anthology, Some Imagist Poets, and she has these 6 tenets. You can read it yourself. I'll just point out, well, the language of common speech, probably, I mean, Wordsworth said that, and that's probably not from Japan. New rhythms, now that could be coming from your English translations from Chinese and Japanese literature going on. That's breaking free from rhyme in a lot of ways. But really, and freedom and choice of subject, okay. But really, number 4 is put a star by that. The core of imagism is image. And I think this way of thinking about image, speaking for itself, is the gift of hokku. And this last thing, the 6th tenet of imagism is really, quote, that concentration is the very essence of poetry. Basho couldn't have said it better. So Pound and his circle of friends, John Gould Fletcher, T.S. Eliot, William Carlos Williams, and his frenemy, Amy Lowell, benefited from the legacy of over 1,000 generations of Japanese renga poets, circles and circles of friends. Nevertheless, a century after this learning moment, and by moment, I mean a window of approximately 25 years, 1888, 1913, poetry editors of the West and even the Chicago Bacon Fest, right? They embraced the aesthetic principles that Pound derived straight from hokku: brevity, pregnant image, sprung rhythm, and a policy of show, don't tell. But they banished from their publications hokku, or by its other name, haiku. So how ironic is that? And are there any questions? You can unmute if you want to talk.
Hi, David. It's Al Pizzarelli.
Hey, Al.
Thank you for that wonderful and very insightful presentation. I enjoyed it very, very much. One thing it brought to mind for me that some listeners might be interested in is, as early as the 1960s and early 70s, mainstream poetry magazines did not accept haiku.
Yeah.
You would even see in some of them, please do not send haiku. This was.
I remember that. Yeah.
You remember that? Yes, most people, the younger poets today, don't realize that. And this is how some of the early haiku magazines sprung about. American Haiku and Haiku West, and over in Canada there was Haiku magazines, Haiku magazine, and eventually others, Byways in England, and Tweed by Jan Bostock, the editor in Australia. And so it gave voice to all of these haiku poets that were seeking to have their work shared and appreciated.
Absolutely. But also it also segregated haiku from the poetic community.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and that wasn't, I think the reason why many of these editors that were listed in, the Poets Market book that they used to put out, was it really, haiku really went over a lot of their heads. I mean, they really didn't get the gist of it, in my opinion, a lot of them. And I think that was one of the reasons. They didn't know how to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to learn not just how to write haiku, but how to read haiku.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. And where's Jay? Thank you, Jay, for inviting me. Oh, guys, this is a warm-up paper. I've been invited to give this paper, and Jay said it'd be okay to use it twice. Later this month at the International Ezra Pound Conference, which was going to be in Kyoto, but now it's all going to be virtual. So if you have any suggestions, speak now or put them in the chat for me, please. Appreciate it.
David.
Yeah.
I had a question. Thank you so much. And I apologize, I had to step out. So for a part of it, I apologize if I'm saying something you covered. But I wondered about the role of Chinese poetics underlying a lot of this. Is that part two? You can't do everything, but Pound had a deep engagement with Chinese poetry, as did the classic haiku hokku poets who often were trained in that. Should we tip our hat to centuries of sort of an imagist tradition in China? And I wonder what you think of the role of that underlying the Japanese tradition.
Well, maybe you did step out when I talked about that, but Pound's translations, loose translations from his English notes, right, of Chinese poetry, that was preceded by translating Japanese no theater and Japanese poetry. So he did the Japanese first, and it's just, he says hokku is what brought about this idea of leaping one image to the other. And if you read traditional Chinese poetry, you don't find the hard break that you find in hokku. So I think he's talking about a hard, jarring leap, like Robert Bly's idea of two electrodes, a spark leaping across the void, because these images aren't explained. They're just put close enough to spark. So I think he got enough from the Japanese to not have to say, the Chinese, but I don't know. So much I don't know. Maybe.
That's great. Thank you, David.
Yeah.
I got a question.
Oh,
I was
actually, sorry, I'm going to jump in. Judson has had his hand up, waiting to ask a question, and then
how do you raise your hand?
Under reactions at the bottom of your screen.
Oh, okay.
You can raise and lower your hand to let folks know, since we've got a large group attending and we have 2 minutes left. So the reality is probably we are not going to get to more than just Judson's question and David's answer. So I would encourage you to follow up with David separately, since we have to wrap up at 10 till.
We have the last question though?
Yeah, from Judson. And then if there's time, we'll grab one more, but I suspect this will do it.
How do we contact them?
Chat, just chat, say hi.
David, do you mind to share? Is it okay if people email you at your work email address?
Sure.
If they have suggestions or questions, and that way they can follow up.
And
with
while
you.
I'm talking about, I have my email, I'll put in david1gerard@hotmail. And Itza_haiku is my Twitter. If you want a daily haiku from Itza in your Twitter, just look for Itza_haiku. I think it's like
I should say also that
Thank you.
we're gonna consult with all of our presenters and those that are willing to share their email, which I'm suspecting is almost all of them. We will then post that. So you'll get everybody, we'll send it out as an email announcement to all our members. So in case you don't happen to catch, an email that goes into the chat or something, we will make that publicly available in just a couple of days.
That's great, Jay. Thank
Justin,
you.
right?
Okay, Judson, you're up.
Okay. These are two very quick, inconclusive thoughts after a really wonderful, rich presentation that was incredibly interesting. One is, I know in my own reading, I've come across references in Lorca's work to acquaintance with Renku, or rather Renga. And I thought that's an interesting maybe dimension of modernism. I can't give you the specifics, but I know I've come across references there. And then also, another dimension to this is the whole question of collaboration, because of course, these are collaborative poems. And I wonder how that had carried over, if we know anything about early modernists doing collaboration with these forms. I'm thinking specifically of the book that was done by Charles Tomlinson, Octavio Paz, and so forth in the 60s. Where they collaborated in they called it renga. Of course, it really wasn't. They were building sonnets together through mail. But I wonder about that intersection between the beginnings of writing Renku, renga, and collaboration, and how that carried over. And that's kind of it. Thanks.
And that makes me wonder about Exquisite Corpse, right?
Exactly.
The surrealist, it's like a painting where you fold the paper 3 ways and you draw the head, you draw the body, you draw the feet, but no one sees until you open it up what you've done. And Exquisite Corpse can also be a poetry game, which I play with my students sometimes. You write a line and I fold the paper, someone else writes the line, fold the paper, and then you open it up, find out what it was about. So I think that has a renga, that's like a blind renga sensitivity. You're trying to get to leaping collaborative surprises without having to think or find a link. Yeah, I think that that's a modern and postmodern movement to move forward. I'm excited about this Alan Summers haiku anthology, because it's going out of self. Hey, he's telling us, if you want your poem published, yeah, of course, but do you appreciate 6 other poems? I think that's beautiful.
Thank you, David, so much. We're a couple minutes over, so I just want to let you know we have a great presentation coming up next. Gary Gay, Renge, a Modern Linking Form, that's going to be moderated by Shelley Baker-Gard. And I think at this point, Ignatius or Jay, somebody's taking this away from me and over to Shelley. Is that correct?
You can pass it directly to Shelley if she should be.
No,
Yeah,
no, she can't.
Yeah, I can't
No.
actually.
Oh, back
Dave.
to Ignatius.
I don't have that.
I have to do that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks all. Great presentation, David. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sai.
Thank you, guys.
Great presentation.
Yes.
Just give me a couple of seconds.
You're also going to make the PowerPoint slides available, again, assuming that presenters are willing to share them. So David just talked about presenting in Kyoto. I don't know if he'd be willing to share based on that reason, but.
Well, my problem with my slides is I don't have copyright permission. I can use it in a private thing like this, but they can't go on the internet because I haven't asked for permission for those images. So I can't share my PowerPoint.
Okay. So some people have, copyright taken care of and they can share their materials. Other people do not. That's why we're going to ask every single presenter if they want to do that. And if so, they'll send it to us and we can post it on the website, or you can email it out separately to individual participants.